Okay, in this video, I'm going to read a bunch of screenshots that I took of headlines from all over the internet. And how I got the headlines was just a simple search of two terms. The first was domestic terrorism, and then the second was far-right extremists. And this is the results that was in the first couple pages of an ordinary Google search just using those two terms. So let's just get started without any further delay. Let's see what the first one is. I don't even know the order that they're in, so we'll just take them as they come here. FBI conducting 2,700 domestic terrorism investigations, Wray tells Congress. And just so you're aware, I'm not going to do much editorializing. I mean, maybe here or there something will pop in my head and I'll elaborate on something. But this might be a little boring because I'm just going to read the headlines as opposed to a normal video where it would be mostly me speaking. And that's just because I had planned to do a different style of video where I was going to edit all of these screenshots together and set it to some background music and then make the video in that way, like I've done a couple times in the past. And then after I took all the screenshots, I kind of saw how many there were, and I said, I'm not editing all that together. I'm just going to hit record and read them. So I think the point will be made the same way either way, and let's read more of these. The top domestic terrorism threat we face continues to be from domestic violent extremists we categorize as racially or ethnically motivated extremists and anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists. This is from the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, The Rising Threat of Domestic Terrorism, a review of the federal response to domestic terrorism and the spread of extremist content on social media. New Senate report finds FBI DHS failing to address threat of domestic terrorism. From November 16th, 2022. Domestic terrorism, understanding the threat and how banks can counter it. Now that's an interesting little twist. This is from October 26, 2022. Oathkeeper admits January 6th was stupid. Kari Lake refuses to admit defeat after losing election. This is from This Week in Extremism. Apparently USA Today has a weekly spotlight on extremism. That's the state that we are in now, where it's a narrative that is so promoted and pervasive that a major publication is doing a weekly review of extremism, quote unquote. Domestic radicalization and violent extremism. This was just a random headline I got from somewhere, apparently. This is why I wish that I had done the video as I had the websites up and the tabs active so that I could see where it came from. But as I said, I wasn't planning on doing the video this way. But just know that this is out there somewhere. This might have actually been from that Senate committee. It looks like the same font and color scheme. Anyway. Since the 2016 election campaign, rhetoric from former President Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans in Congress has inspired right-wing domestic terrorists to violence. In this time, we have seen an uptick of extremists of all types willing to engage in political violence. We've seen militia groups mobilize to violence for the 2020 election, and we've seen political violence continue throughout and beyond Trump's presidency. And of course, in line with this narrative is the backdrop that I have chosen for this video, where Elon Musk has restored Trump's Twitter account after online polls. So let the fun begin, as it were. Domestic terrorism is a threat we can't ignore, from November 2nd, 2022. Domestic terrorism investigations and arrests shot up in 2021. October 28th, 2022. David DePape represents new trend in domestic terrorism. And of course, this is the person that allegedly attacked one of the Pelosi's. I don't even remember which one. I think it was the husband. This is from November 1st, 2022. And you see what is accomplished with a headline like this by spinning this story in the way that they are spinning it. They're telling you, hey, it's shifting now where the average person is thinking that they need to be violent with a politician from the other side. That's how polarized everything is. And that's how big the problem is. That's why we need censorship online. We need to address this ability to just speak, because it's quote unquote radicalizing people to take action against people that don't deserve it, quote unquote. Right? So they're spinning this new narrative where we have to be so very careful of the rising new threat of domestic terrorism, as evidenced by this person who allegedly hit one of the Pelosi's with a hammer on their head. Now, I'll leave it to you to address the question of, did that actually happen in the way that it has been portrayed? Hey, your guess is as good as mine. I leave that up to you to decide. But whether or not it happened is irrelevant, right? Or however it happened is irrelevant to how they have used it to further this agenda, to promote the idea of domestic terrorism and far-right extremism. And as I was saying in the prior video, how they have merged 4chan into Fox News and vice versa. They have merged Fox News into 4chan. They've melded them together. And in that way, they are creating the extremist caricature, the problem that must be addressed. And indeed, many people like this are said to have visited those kind of sites. Oh, that's where they were hanging out online. That's where they were radicalized. Oh, and then they have a blog where they were repeating standard racist and other type of rhetoric that we know is indicative of a domestic terrorist. FBI, DHS warn of growing domestic terror threats. And of course, DHS is all over this narrative because it justifies their continued existence well after that war on terror, quote unquote, kind of dissipated and no longer exists in the way that it did. That was the entire purpose of the creation of the DHS. At the time, anyway. A Department of Homeland Security report shows how the Trump administration falsely categorized people as threats during George Floyd protests in 2020. So you see, it's not just one side of the spectrum here. It's everyone involved is promoting this idea that we have this growing problem of domestic terrorism. A standard protest, regardless of what the impetus for the protest is, even if it is done under false pretenses, the very idea of protesting is now considered extreme, right? That's an extremist activity. And then very quickly they slide you down to, oh, it's not only is it extreme, it's domestic terrorism. How do we fight a new kind of terrorism? The stock response to mass violence is often, this isn't us, but of course it is. And you can see the branding of it in this headline, right? It's just what I was talking about. A new kind of terrorism. Oh, we're moving into a new kind of terrorism that requires all sorts of new solutions and regulations and responses from the government, etc. FBI director, domestic terrorists increasingly inspired by international attacks. 3 men plead guilty to domestic terrorism crime related to plans to attack power grids. This is an interesting one to get out there in February of last year. There is a rich tradition of speculation regarding a potential plan involving the power grids and cyber attacks and foreign intelligences, and just very interesting that this is out there floating around, let's say. Because this isn't the only one. There are more like it. Attorney General never called concerned parents domestic terrorists. And this is an article from April of last year that surrounded the acting Attorney General making comments that painted local parents concerned about what was happening in their schools as domestic terrorists. And of course, they walked it back and said, oh, we never said that, because it got so much backlash at the time, given what it actually implied when you read it. So this was just an interesting little story that was out there early last year where, okay, now we're calling ordinary parents extremists for caring about what their children are taught in school, right? Oh, we're going to push this narrative that far, huh? We're going to have it be just regular parents now that are domestic terrorists for showing up at school boards, right? This is extremist activity, going back to the idea of protesting being extreme now. But of course, we're not that far from the future where anything against the party, there will only be one party, right? That's what every communist regime has. It's just the party. And they might have R&D next to their name still, but it's the party. And if you go against it, you are an extremist. You're a domestic terrorist. That's where we are headed, I hope you see. U.S. cited domestic terrorism in search tied to Oath Keeper's lawyer. Unsealed opinion appears to be the first time the federal court in D.C. has disclosed prosecutors' invocation of a Patriot Act provision to obtain a search warrant in the January 6th probe. So this is layer upon layer of psychological operations. They're invoking a prior psychological operation, the fruits of that, the Patriot Act, as a part of this new psychological operation. And in that way, you just build the staircase to your eventual destination. You build the apparatus in that way. And that gets right into what I was talking about, how they're shifting the war on terror into domestic terrorism, now using actual provisions from the Patriot Act that was designed for international terrorism, terrorism outside our borders, protecting America in that way, or whatever country you live in where they have similar provisions. And now they're using those provisions against ordinary citizens, right? Now, of course, in this case, they will say, well, we had a good reason. Days after Buffalo mass shooting, the House approves a bill to fight domestic terror. This is from May of last year. 2022, I should say, depending on when you're listening to this. Mississippi police arrest suspect in church arson that Democrat called tactic to suppress votes. The Mississippi Democrat congressional candidate said that the incident invoked historical acts of terrorism. Again, linking the act of arson, setting something on fire, with terrorism. Now, of course, it could be that, but it also could just be a pyromaniac or something, right? Who just wanted to set something on fire. I'm not saying that's what it was, but it's just everything that happens now is being labeled with this word because it is an obvious agenda, right? That's the point of this video. CPAC Dallas panel proclaims, "We are all domestic terrorists." And this is all a part of the normalization of a narrative, the comedy angle, where you have referential humor. That is a way to normalize it in the public mind, in the public consciousness. Oh yeah, we make fun of that now. It's just a normal thing. That's kind of a branch off of the main narrative where it's deadly serious. It's like comedians use the phrase too soon. Oh, is it too soon? Because that's kind of the demarcation of when they can go into that mode of normalization. I think we already read one about this, but Buffalo shooting suspect is indicted on a domestic terrorism charge. That's just an interesting change from what ordinary, I mean, that's kind of a bit poor word choice, right? But ordinary shooters in events like this are charged with. Now they are being charged as domestic terrorists because it is a part of this agenda to get this idea out there as a thing that we all need to be concerned about. Department of Justice unveils new domestic terror unit as U.S. faces persistent and evolving threats. A year after January 6th, officials warn. Rosen secures support from Secretary of Homeland Security and FBI Director on national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. This is from November 17th, 2022. And of course, this is associated with domestic terrorism and extremism. All those words are becoming synonymous with each other due to the influence of this agenda that is being promoted by a wide range, as we see here, of news and media sources. Auditors, Oregon ranks high for domestic terrorism. Legislature should do more. Oregon is one of 16 states that doesn't define domestic terrorism in criminal law. I'm sure this is a trend that will be changing in the near future for these 16 states. How the replacement theory is fueling white domestic terrorism. Prosecuting domestic terrorism is notoriously difficult. This new team of lawyers has a mounting caseload. Biden's new domestic terrorism unit bad for freedom-loving Americans from January of 2022. Dozens of extremists on Twitter now sport the blue check, once reserved for verified accounts, after signing up for the paid Twitter Blue service under policies instituted by the platform's new proprietor, Elon Musk. And if you haven't figured out how this works, normally, they are painting Elon Musk with two brushes, right? From the perspective of one side, he's a freedom fighter. He's for all of these freedom concepts. And he's on your side. And on the other side, he's being painted with the brush that's, this guy is a terrorist. He's an example of everything that's wrong with the world. We can't let him be in charge of Twitter. And in that way, they will use these narratives, play them off of each other. So in the end, Elon Musk will end up implementing the level of control that they always wanted to have on Twitter. But it will be done under the guise of giving you freedom of speech. I mean, he already alluded to this when he said, oh, you'll be able to say whatever you want, but our new algorithm will just boot you down way into the recesses of Twitter where no one will be able to find you. And then it's a slow progression from there. I mean, he already said, too, that he wanted to turn it into like China's WeChat. And then, obviously, when the model is something China's doing, use your imagination about where they want that to head. It's never in a good direction. Far-right fanatics are trying to make 3D printed guns for deadly attacks, MI5 boss says. Extremists in uniform put the nation at risk. Now, this is getting people to think about what's happening in the military. Oh, can we let people with certain social media views be allowed to wear uniforms? Or police officers, for example. I mean, in California, they can get neighbors to tell on each other for using too much water based on the terror of the climate narrative that they promote. So we're not far off from this kind of thing, too. Oh, I read my neighbor who's a police officer said this on their Facebook page or whatever they use. I'm going to report them and get them fired. We can't have police officers thinking like an extremist. Opinion. Why My Pillow Guy is a central figure in the rise of right-wing extremism. I think we've reached the screenshots of when my search term changed. We're into right-wing extremism now. This is from October 28th, 2022. We are a tinderbox. Political violence is ramping up, experts warn. Oh, the experts warn something. That's when we got to get a little nervous. Opinion. Don't blame both sides. The right is driving political violence, from October 30th, 2022. America can have democracy or political violence, not both. And this is the kind of fiercely rigid arguments that you'll see put out there because it's so easy to navigate public opinion when you have only two fiercely divided possibilities. It's like George Bush said back in the day, you're either with us or you're against us, right? And that'll be it. You're either with the party or against the party. Right-wing extremists and conspiracy theorists are spreading hate on Twitter with their newly purchased blue checkmarks. Oh, we already got into that one. More national security threats come from domestic left-wing extremists, experts. So here you have the exact opposite opinion about the threat of domestic extremism. But of course, I hope you see, it doesn't matter which side we're talking about here. It's the normalization of the idea that this is something that's actually happening. A right-wing extremist active in a racist online chat room has interviewed multiple Arizona GOP candidates. Anti-Semitism is center stage in the Telegram channel where Jackson is an active member. This is from October 25th, 2022. Right-wing extremism in the military. This research paper identifies 5 potential consequences which may emerge from the presence of radicalized personnel within Western militaries. Right-wing extremists. The danger not of bombs, but ballots. You see? Wow, that's really interesting alliteration there. equating your ballot to a bomb based on who is casting it and what we have categorized their views as representing. That's the goal of 4chan and Fox News merging together, right? Extremists have a political voice. This is very dangerous. Mainstreaming extremism, the legacy of far-right violence from the past to the present. And those are think tanks where people are paid a lot of money to research these types of things. Understanding global right-wing extremism. Mayor Wu, Boston has become a target for white supremacists and right-wing extremists. This is what I was talking about earlier. I couldn't believe this headline. Are there far-right extremist groups in your neighborhood? That's what I was talking about earlier. It's funny how I see these headlines, I remember grabbing it, and then I get to it before I actually show the screenshot, right? I remember seeing this, and that's what I was talking about earlier. This is the scariest one of all. What are people going to do with this one if they really believe all these narratives are going on? Report on legislators in far-right Facebook groups doesn't tell real story of Kansas extremism. From June of 2022. 2 January 6th defendants in the consolidation of right-wing extremism. From June of 2022. Raskin brings expertise on right-wing extremism to January 6th inquiry. Elected officials, police chiefs on leaked list of far-right extremist group members from September 8th, 2022. There you go again, right? This is infiltrating itself into the most normal aspects of society. YouTube went to war against terrorists, not just white nationalists. Again, that headline from Business Week associating the two together. A new book details the video site's ongoing struggles with the blurry lines of extremist speech from August of 2022. Right-wing extremists amp up anti-LGBTQ rhetoric online. Here again we have online radicalization from extremists on the right wing. Domestic terrorists. Rise of the extreme right, the new global extremism, and the threat to democracy from August of 2022. The transnational element of right-wing extremism in Australia from May of 2022. Australia is not the United States, but we cannot dismiss the rise of right-wing extremism from June of 2022. Dutch right-wing extremists fueled by Ukrainian war from, it's in reverse in Europe, from April of 2022. Or I suppose it's in reverse in America, kind of like the measurement system we use. Guns are fueling the rise in domestic extremist violence across the country from September of 2022. The right's violence problem. The Buffalo killings are part of a pattern. Most extremist violence in the U.S. comes from the political right. What the zeitgeist can tell us about the future of terrorism. This is from a professor emeritus in June of 2022, and the keywords were just interesting to me. Zeitgeist, right-wing extremism, populism, violent extremism. Of course, Donald Trump is the populist president, the conspiracy theorist president, all of those things by design. As right-wing rhetoric escalates, so do threats and violence. German right-wing extremists mobilize for autumn protests against high energy prices. And this is just interesting from July of 2022, where they're equating people protesting outrageous prices to cool and heat their homes with right-wing extremism, right? This is, again, normalizing the idea that any kind of protest against what the party is doing on a world stage is extremism. It's domestic terrorism. What to watch for in Tuesday's January 6th committee hearing on right-wing extremist groups from July of 2022. Far-right groups shift focus to LGBTQ events. Their hateful aim hasn't changed from June of 2022. Experts, alleged plot against governor signals ominous shift. This is from March 2022. FBI search ignited violent rhetoric on the far right. Some pro-Trump media figures reacted to the search at Mar-a-Lago with talk of war, the clearest outburst of such language since the days leading up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And it's not hard to imagine why that would happen to the ordinary people who actually are in the thick of all this and believe it. Based on what they have been told, they think, it's justified to react in that way. And that's a part of the game on the other side of what all the controlled opposition figures who supposedly are giving them the truth are feeding into their minds, because it provokes the very reactions that the other side is looking for to write headlines like this, you see. Why right-wing extremists love the Unabomber. That's a great one. From October 17th, 2021. The right-wing assault hits close to home. And that makes sense because you'll hear a lot of people involved in those online conspiracy forum scenes talk about how evil society is, how evil everything around them is. And in that way, they are sort of resonating with what Ted Kaczynski was saying in his manifesto about the influence of technology and modern life on human beings. Pentagon updates its rules on extremism in the military. Liking white nationalist and extremist content on social media could result in disciplinary action, Defense Department officials said. Man killed in Belgian raid on suspected far-right extremists. Belgian prosecutors say a man was shot dead during anti-terror raids targeting a group of suspected right-wing extremists from September of 2022. The far-right Christian quest for power, we are seeing them emboldened. Concerns grow over the increasing ties between Christianity and right-wing nationalism from October of 2022. And of course, those who are familiar with Bible prophecy will be familiar with how this is one of the most obvious things that they tell you will see in the end times is you will be persecuted for being a quote-unquote Christian. And I'm not getting into what it means to be a Christian, all the different iterations of that, and I've done that in many other videos. But just the idea of religion, Christianity, and what it means to adhere to that in the context of this agenda. Reading the Bible will eventually be the same as everything else, extremism. If you repeat a Bible verse on social media as a police chief or in the military, for example, that's extremist content. I don't know, that's a slippery slope to domestic terrorism there, repeating that Bible verse. We're going to have to put you on temporary leave and possibly kick you out. How extremism went mainstream. Washington needs a new approach to preventing far-right violence. Ah, yes. We need regulations, new laws in place to deal with this growing threat. Clear links between Serbia's Bureau for Diaspora and French right-wing extremists. And you know, it's interesting. There's a huge civil war going on in South Sudan right now, and has been for years. And you don't hear much talk in the media about domestic terrorism and extremists there, right? It's just a justified civil war. There's none of this talk going on when nothing even close to the level of atrocities happening there are happening here. This seems to be a Western problem. Germany records highest level of right-wing extremist crime in 20 years. Right-wing extremism is the greatest threat to security in our country, the German Interior Minister said. How the U.S. Capitol attack highlights the challenges of thwarting online right-wing extremism. From January of 2021. Right-wing extremists and their supporters use Christian website to raise funds. This is from CNN in January of 2021. A year later, local governments brace for January 6th. In the wake of the U.S. Capitol riot, right-wing extremist groups have focused on attacking democratic institutions at the local level, from school board meetings to election commissions. And you see, this is what they tried to walk back, as they were giving these reports on this type of thing, and then there was a huge backlash, and they kind of walked it back. But here we have the headline where they were trying to associate these things together. Deconstructing the extreme right. I'm not sure why I copied this one. Kind of a pointless screenshot. My apologies. Let's see. Oregon's long history of enabling extremists. We kind of went over that already. Subscribestar, an online subscription platform, is allowing dozens of far-right propagandists, conspiracy theorists, and purveyors of medical misinformation to generate almost $2 million a year from fans. Hate Watch has established. Hate Watch. That's a thing, apparently. MWI podcast, Far-Right Extremism and the War in Ukraine since 2014. From August of 2022. The far-right Proud Boys have ramped up a campaign aimed specifically at attacking LGBTQ rights and reproductive justice. Explainer, a look at far-right extremists in January 6th riot. Report, conspiracy theorists fuel bump extremist killings in U.S. From February of 2022. Assessing U.S. domestic extremism in light of Capitol riot investigations. It's happening here. Massachusetts has a growing neo-Nazi movement. Members of right-wing militias, extremist groups, are latest charged in Capitol siege. How to win back loved ones lost to extreme views. Oh, man. I mean, I shouldn't laugh because people can get lost in this stuff in a way that is not beneficial to their life. But just the way that this headline reads is very cringe. So, as if you can be saved if you are won back to what the mainstream news sources are telling you. That's possibly the biggest joke ever told. Right-wing extremists, persistent online presence, history and contemporary trends. Gender and right-wing extremism in America. Why understanding women's roles is key to preventing future acts of domestic terrorism. I mean, this is just so strange how they're equating Roe versus Wade and biological reproduction with domestic terrorism and far-right extremism. It's just another way that they wedge emotion so deep within people's minds and get them so on edge when discussing all this stuff. It's just wild to see all of this stuff listed in the same sentence, the same headline. The rise in political violence in the United States and damage to our democracy. It's a republic, but no one seems to care what it really is. India's Hindu extremists are calling for genocide against Muslims. Why is little being done to stop them? Not even India is immune from the problem of extremists. From 9/11 to 1/6, the war on terror supercharged the far right. From October of 2021. The majority of Americans do not support right-wing extremism. Elon Musk and right-wing extremism, part of the problem, not the solution. He was rather quick to amplify disinformation that served the Trumpian right. You can just imagine the smug tone that was actually said in when somebody read it out loud. The Trumpian right. We're so much better than them. Preparing for the worst. Political violence in America by right-wing extremists will not end anytime soon. From November of 2022. 6 notable terrorist attacks by right-wing extremists. Dark money ATM injected right-wing groups with $123 million in 2021. Netanyahu needed the far right to win. Now he has to manage it. U.S. midterm elections threatened by right-wing extremists. That's going to be a headline that is put up there for every future election in this country and the West in general, I'm sure, but especially in America. New York Times warns right-wing political violence from within the U.S. military and police put the nation at risk. Fighting extremism in the schools. So this is just wild stuff, man. Israel, extremists tell U.S. not to interfere in government formation. Litwin, Pelosi's husband is savagely beaten by right-wing extremists and Trump says nothing. Radical right-wing upsurge in U.S. op-ed from November 2022. Italian cops take down a cult neo-Nazi group preparing for violent attacks. The problems in Italy, too. The growing danger of political violence. And finally, Elon Musk reinstated some banned Twitter accounts. And as we saw here, he has even reinstated Trump's Twitter account as of today, November 20th, 2022. But he draws the line at extremists like Alex Jones. And that summarizes the whole thing very nicely, doesn't it? One of their own is the example of the line that cannot be crossed. And Alex Jones represents everyone who talks about similar subjects along these lines. And they are all now extremists just like he is. That's it.